Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Troy Walsh, and I'm the Executive Director of First Nations Equity and Inclusion here at Arts Centre Melbourne. I'm also an immensely proud Palawa man. I would like to commence with an acknowledgement of country. Arts Centre Melbourne and the Melbourne Arts Precinct sit on a site that has been a gathering place for song, storytelling, community and culture for First Nations people for millennia. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung. We also acknowledge the neighbouring Kulin Nation groups, the Bunurong and Bunurong people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Arts Centre Melbourne is very privileged to host today's memorial. Sue's contribution to our organisation and the industry was profound. The number of people she personally touched and influenced is reflected in how many people are gathering today to celebrate her life. I would like to invite Toby Pond, Sue's nephew, to say a few words.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Troy, for the introduction and the acknowledgement of country. For those who don't know, I was Sue's nephew, and I think, as some people know, often referred to as the baby giraffe, as you can see why today. I also would like to just quickly acknowledge David Anderson for pulling this event together and for the Arts Centre for hosting it. It's deeply appreciated. And today we're here to remember Sue in all her guises, with Maria, Jess, Wesley, Stephen and John to share their memories of Sue as a person, colleague and mentor and friend. I also should warn you that I'm going to cry a lot, so apologies for that in advance. Now, noting that I knew Sue not as the woman in the arts, I thought I'd share some memories of the woman I knew as a parent and let everybody else talk about her as a professional in the industry. I'd also like to add that this is how Sue would want to be remembered. She loved the sharing and telling of stories, and I can think of nothing more fitting than gathering after the 6 of us have finished sharing our memories in the bar upstairs to share some of your own. Sitting around and having a natter, as she would have said, is how she would want to be remembered and farewelled. So to honour Sue today, I wanted to share some shared family memories of the woman we called Nolly, a name given her by her brother Johnny when she was a toddler. Now, for those who don't know, Sue could convince almost anybody of everything, including her parents, that when she was 3 years old, she was old enough to go to school because her brother Johnny was, who was 5. And they sent her. So that meant that she ended up finishing high school for the first time when she was 16 and still too young to go to university. So she repeated at Cora a second year. Sue was a constant in my life. She was always encouraging, always supportive, and nearly always asking me if I had enough to eat that day or enough sleep the night before. And one of her hallmarks as a parent, and I'm told as a friend as well, is that by dint of her interest in people and the love of a good chat with anyone and everyone, she had a story about literally any situation you might find yourself in. For example, sleep. Now, we've all been tired and generally understand that not sleeping is bad. Most parents, I suspect, would simply say, get more sleep, which is what I tell my daughter. But not Sue. She'd see me having been up all night studying and remind me about the time she stayed up for 3 days straight working. It apparently involved packing up a show in Melbourne and then driving it to Perth, and how after 3 days of not sleeping, she started hallucinating that there was a little old lady carrying a basket of eggs across the Nullarbor Highway that she had to swerve to avoid, almost crashing in the process. In classic Sue fashion, it was both memorable, the lady with the eggs, informative, because if you don't sleep for 3 days, you will likely die, and effective, because I remember it, it sort of was a reason why I would actually go to sleep. And one of the things I'm beginning to reflect on with her death is that there are so many of these stories of hers that I'll never get to the bottom of. Why was she driving across the Nullarbor herself? Surely she was the boss, and even when she wasn't, she was still the boss. So why wasn't there more of a team effort here that meant that the safety of the techs and the stage sets weren't in jeopardy? What was the show? What was the old lady carrying a basket of eggs wearing, and how did you know it was eggs? Were they cooked or in their shells? And there is a distinct possibility with Sue that the hallucinations could have involved a basket of perfectly scrambled eggs, but alas, we'll never know. As many of you do know, Sue loved cooking and food, and in particular she loved eggs, as evidenced by the hallucinations clearly. She was at core someone who could tolerate pretty much anything and anyone, but serve her a poorly cooked egg and she wouldn't be rude, she just wouldn't lie and tell you that she liked it. One of her core beliefs as a human being was that everyone should, as a moderately civilised person, have a cast iron pan in their retinue of kitchen equipment dedicated solely to the making of omelettes. She believed this pan should be well seasoned, wiped clean rather than washed after use, and never ever used for anything other than omelettes. And when I moved out of home, she gave me a pan to use for omelettes. And I have to confess here in front of you all that Tom, my housemate at the time, and I used it for many things, but omelettes was not one of them. Sue and I shared a connection over food, as she did with many of you here. It was one of the ways she showed love, making breakfasts for anyone who turned up vaguely close to breakfast time, cups of tea, and thinking about lunch. When I was quite young, probably around 4, I went through a phase of eating a boiled egg for breakfast every day, and I'd scoop out the insides and then I'd turn it upside down and put it in a waiting egg cup and serve it to her. And she would, without fail, attempt to crack it open and then play act the shock and confusion of having an empty eggshell trick played successfully once more. I have no idea how many times I must have done this, but she reacted to it with gusto every time. And while she loved good food, she wasn't precious about it, as evidenced by the story of her infamous Tasmanian walking trip of the 60s. Now, if anyone here today was on that trip, I apologise in advance. She and some friends are in Tasmania hiking, are exhausted and in the middle of nowhere in the Freycinet Peninsula. They managed to flag down a fishing boat that was trawling past, pulled their money, swam out to it, and bought a few crayfish for their much-anticipated dinner. Now, Sue, of course, volunteered to cook, and when she cut the lobsters open, found they were infested with maggots. As she described it, they needed to eat, they had nothing else, and so she quietly scraped out the maggots without telling anyone, boiled the lobsters in a sort of lobster bisque over the fire, and dinner was served. For years and years afterwards, she told me that whenever she saw friends from that trip, they always mentioned the walk and the lobster bisque as one of the singularly exceptional things they'd ever eaten in their lives. So clearly, Sue was a firm believer in giving everyone a go, a fair go, even if it seems suspect lobsters. Now, Sue was the most stoic and calm person I think I've ever met. And I do understand you're supposed to idolise your parents to some degree, but I actually think she was. She taught me that things were never as bad as they seemed, and even if they were, you still needed to get on with it. Unfortunately for her, this meant that she ended up being the designated party responsible in our house for dealing with all the gross things that the many dogs, cats and birds we had in the house came down with. We dubbed her Dr. Nattrass when she was busy patching an ear or doing something unmentionable with one of the animals. It was a bit of a running joke between her and Mum, as Sue had thought about studying medicine to become a doctor when she graduated high school the first time at 16. She was too young, and so after doing the second year, as I mentioned earlier, she was actually at that point put off by the idea of signing up for all those years of study. She instead started a commerce degree, and once on campus at Melbourne University, fell in love with the theatre and dropped out of commerce. She lit Barry Humphrey's first ever show, which is timely given his passing this week. She did have the last laugh, however, when Deakin University granted her an honorary doctorate of letters, and she gleefully updated her contact details to Dr. Sue Nattrass. I think that she more than earned it, if not for the 50-year career in the arts, then for the multiple boils lanced and bleeding pet appendages bandaged. In the last few years, when her health wasn't as good as it could have been, she never complained. She just sat down and patiently counted out the 1,000,001 pills she was taking, tracked her insulin, visited the specialists that needed visiting, and kept on looking after everyone in her orbit. I don't know how she did it. Whenever we visited, she insisted on measuring her granddaughter Pip's height against her own, and so this became a regular part of the visit, Sue pulling herself upright to work out where Pip was now, from tummy to chest to shoulder. She loved her dearly, and when Sue found out that Pip loved horses and horse riding, she took me aside and made me swear never to do to Pip what happened to her when she was about the same age, and asked her parents for a horse. Her brother Johnny was seriously allergic to horses, and despite this, Sue had asked if she could have one, which doesn't sound too outrageous given they were living on a working farm at the time. For reasons that have been lost to time, her dad said yes, and then on Christmas Day gave her a brooch in the shape of a horse. She never forgot it and was still grumpy about it 70-odd years later. It was through her stories like this that she taught me the value of history, of family and friendship. These stories are often about small moments, but they were suffused with a deeper meaning about how to live, how to be a good and honest person, and how to be generous. Some of these stories have been handed down and are now really part of our legacy. And now Pip knows that the reason we call a rubber spatula used for scraping out mixing bowls a Mrs. Vincent is because when Sue and Kay and Johnny were kids, they had a neighbour called Mrs. Vincent who would bake a cake and then call the kids in to lick the bowl. The problem was that this Mrs. Vincent used a rubber spatula to clean every last bit of cake off the bowl first before handing it to the kids, which seems like a pretty awful thing to do. So when I was growing up, we referred to the spatula as the Mrs. Vincent, and now my family does the same. Through this and countless other acts of memory and storytelling, we discuss how much is fair to leave behind for little fingers to scrape out and lick from the bowl. We learn how to be generous with the small and the large things, and hopefully become better people into the bargain. Now, Sue was many things, but generous, I think, typifies her. She was generous with her time, her friendship, her attention, her love for those nearest and dearest to her. It showed when she would engage in deep conversation with everyone she encountered, no airs and graces. She believed there was something in everyone she met worth knowing and understanding. Now, I believe that the generosity of spirit and warmth is what drew people to her and what allowed her to be a wonderful parent, grandparent, friend, leader and mentor. As Sue's darling granddaughter said after her death, "I can't believe I'll never hear her say to me, 'Hello, Miss Pip,' again." I feel the same way. It doesn't really seem possible that Sue is no longer with us. It doesn't seem right, and selfishly, it doesn't seem fair. I do know that the last year or so was really tough for her, with poor health and the commitment she made to help keep herself going for her family. I'd like to particularly thank Gail Essler, Jenny Connolly, my partner Anna, and of course Mum, who was with Sue with her in her final hours. I'm truly thankful that she didn't suffer and that she was surrounded by her loved ones in those last days and hours, and that she's unburdened and at rest. I'd now like to hand over to Maria, who will be no doubt share some stories of Sue that my 8-year-old ears weren't ready to hear. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria O'Connor. I knew Sue from her first days at the Arts Centre in 1983. Well, there wasn't an Arts Centre in 1983, it was being built. We were housed in the old YMCA building, for those of you who are old enough like me to remember that. It was the old triangular building shaped. It was on the corner of Sturt Street and City Road, where the ballet centre is today. Or maybe that's being knocked down too, I'm not really sure at the minute, the way things look out there. At that time, the Arts Centre owned the state's ticketing company, Bass Victoria, and I was one of the small team that ran Bass at the time. And Sue had just joined the Arts Centre as the theatre operations manager, joining from J.C. Williamson's. So as a in my early 20s, my first impression of Sue then was she was imposing but calm and friendly. And that's a very unusual mixture. She walked into the little computer room where Bass mainframes, which all computers were run on then, were housed. And I, as a computer operator, was doing my best to keep the area sterile in the crumbling building. I think it had been condemned back in the 30s, but we were still living in it. And said, "G'day, love, I'm Sue. What do you do?" Every other person I had met since I'd started in April of 1981 was male. Not that I thought that was strange. 42 years ago, that was the norm. As I thought about Sue since she died and her impact on Victoria, the arts industry, and on me personally, I realised that Sue was a rebel. She was a trailblazer without ever having to fire a shot in anger. In this time, before inclusion, diversity, gender equality was a thing, she simply was inclusive, diverse in her thinking and recruitment, and she was always gender equal. Sue achieved this by just being a good, kind, generous, firm, fair, and compassionate person. But she did have one fault, and that was she didn't judge people, even when she should have or needed to. Sometimes, in sheer frustration, I would say, "Sue, for God's sake, can't you see this person is just a bastard?" Or even worse, she would just look at me calmly and say, "Love, there's no point getting upset." I used to come back to my office and say to my colleagues, "The problem with Sue is she's a saint." And that would just frustrate us in a way, and she just never, ever got upset. So those of you who knew Sue well would know that she kept everything in her bra. Her keys, her purse, her mobile phone, which in the early 80s was the size of a brick. The young men who used to work for me, who would go up to use her car, would come down with their eyes on stalks, holding the keys like this, because they were still warm, and come and say, "You can't believe it. I went in and asked Jess, can I use Sue's car?" And he could go and get them from her, and everything would come out of the bra. One thing about Sue is she treated everyone the same. She loved helping people. She would often be seen taking leftover food from the Vic restaurant and other Arts Centre catering outlets to the St Kilda Mission on her way home. She looked after Betty Pounder and her husband John Baines, going round to their home each day, in the middle of the day, as they became old and infirm, and this was why she was the CEO at the Arts Centre. The biggest love of her life, of course, was Toby, the young giraffe, as she used to call him. And I had to say, Toby, but when we were in trouble, or when things didn't go right, or we stuffed up, we would go and tell her the bad news, and then we'd say, how's Toby? And her eyes would light up, and she'd get all animated, and then she would spend the whole rest of the meeting time talking about Toby. And that's how you got away with murder. Actually, John Machete had it down to a fine art. He would just get away with murder by doing that. She knew everybody's name, what they did, where they came from, and you would sit in your office and you could hear her say, it's the big Sheila. And she'd go around and she'd talk to everyone. She just allowed people to flourish and grow. I know it's going to be hard for you to believe this, but 40 years ago, I was a bit of a rebel. And she knew to give me space to develop and grow with what was within, the public sector, a bit restrictive. And she knew that Bass in those days needed to grow because most of its business was coming from without the Arts Centre. And she would allow me to do things, and she encouraged my sort of ask for forgiveness, not for permission sort of approach to life. And she would fill in the forms that I didn't want to fill in, and she would do things that I didn't want to do because she wanted me to flourish. And I believed that Ticketmaster today, which Bass became, wouldn't have existed and wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for Sue. She and I would talk a lot about culture and theatre and arts, and in those days I was only a few years out of Ireland, and my love of literature, music, politics, theatre. And she used to say quite often that culture isn't something you do after 5 or on the weekends. And I think about that every day, about what culture is and what makes you Australian or Irish or whatever it is that you are. And she really believed that. When she was CEO of the Arts Centre, she would be asked for a comment on every issue impacting the community. Such was her profile and connection to the city of Melbourne and the people of Victoria. She wasn't seen as an arts person. She never whinged or complained. She never took pot shots at other organisations, subsidised or commercial. That was unusual then, and it's still unusual today. She was an interesting business leader. She wasn't the power suit, makeup, or high heels type, so other business women didn't know how to approach her, and most men just saw her as an arts lovey with no business acumen. She initiated the Arts Centre's involvement with the BHP Executive Development Programme and was one of the initial supporters of the Williamson Community Leadership Programme, which is now Leadership Victoria. She always impressed her business audiences with the size, scope, scale, and the risk profile of her business. I remember very clearly one year she came to meet me at a Ticketmaster conference at Santa Barbara, California. She came to meet the executives of Ticketmaster. When I introduced her to the then CEO, who stood up to shake her hand, she leaned over and said, "Do you know your fly's open?" Needless to say, that was a very quick meeting. By the early 1990s, I was heading up Bass, and it was on the Kennett government's list for privatisation. So I got to spend a lot more time with Sue, who by this time was the CEO of the Arts Centre. So as we worked through the process, we had a lot of difficult meetings about privatisation, what it meant for the staff, what precedents we were setting for other state-owned enterprises. But I did love to meet in her office. The desk phone would ring, and you never knew who would be on the other end. It could be a world-renowned musician, could be an actor, could be a playwright, could be a prime minister. And one time it rang, and it was a prime minister, and he asked for Sue, and I said, "Sue, it's the prime minister." She wrinkled up her nose. She goes, "Tell him I'll ring him back." And I'll let you guess which one it was. So, I just loved, Sue was so down to earth. During the privatization process, two executives came from the US, and I think they either came on a private jet, but they definitely would have minimum flown first class. Sue went to pick them up in her station wagon that she had taken the two dogs to St Kilda Beach that morning. I think the dogs were called Dingo and Millie Molly Mandy. And I can't even smell because I have allergies, but even I could smell Dingo and Millie Molly Mandy in the car. And the look on their faces was absolutely priceless, was they were brushing the sand and the dog hair off them. And Sue just sort of shrugged her shoulders as she put their bags in the back of the car. And that was Sue. That was just it was herself, no matter where she was with. And the other famous story I have of Sue was, through the process, we went to LA to meet with lawyers and the M&A team, and we were a bit early for a meeting in Los Angeles. Now, some of these stories I've had to clean up because of the language, so those of you know, and I've had, she used to say to me, if you remind me what I've done, and I'll write the book. So now I might write the book. Now, as the longer I live, the people die, I can write more books. But, so we were a bit early for a meeting, so that we all went into the Biltmore Hotel in LA for a coffee. And everybody, this is like 10 o'clock in the morning, and everybody's dressed the men are all in dinner jackets and tuxedos, and the ladies are all in magnificent dresses. And we asked what's going on. They said, they're taping an episode of ER, which is the hit program of the time. And you have to leave because it's closed set. And as we're being escorted to the door, we could hear people going, "Sue, Sue, Sue." And half the people on set, with the stage, the cameramen, the actor, knew who Sue was. So we had to spend 30 minutes while they all came and paid their respects. And the American people were so impressed with Sue, how she just stood there and caught up with everybody that she knew. So she knew everybody. And so I'm going to leave you with a thought. I have often say to my colleagues that I have had two mentors in my life, a good one who sat on my right shoulder, and that's Sue, and a bad one who sits on my left shoulder, and I'm not going to tell you who that is. And I'll just leave you with an Irish saying, is that the like of her will never pass this way again. And I think we've all been very fortunate, those of us who knew Sue and loved Sue. She has made an impact on so many people's lives, and that will last forever. So I am now going to pass you over to Jess Anderson, who looked after Sue, lucky enough to look after Sue for many years. Thank you.
Hi, I'm writing a piece from Kathy Massey, who writes, "First, I'm so very sorry I can't be there in person to celebrate the life of such a remarkable person as Sue Nattrass, but I'm in Italy as you gather together. I'm sure there's little I can say that won't have been said already by others, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to make a small contribution. Sue touched many, many lives. Her combination of brilliant intellect, deep humanity, practical know-how, kindness, and courage was exceptional. She achieved so much in her life, but perhaps her greatest achievement was the enormously positive impact she had on the many people who knew her and loved her. One aspect of Sue's career that may not be as well known as others is the time she stepped in to save the 2002 Adelaide Festival of the Arts, considered the jewel in the crown of South Australia arts and cultural firmament, and under serious threat. I had recently taken on the role of as head of Arts South Australia, only to be confronted by the sudden departure of the festival's artistic director, followed by the resignation of the chairman, of the board, the general manager, and other key staff. The only person I could think of who would have the ability to save this near disaster was Sue. I clearly remember phoning Sue on one Sunday morning in August 2001 and begging her to fly to Adelaide on the Monday. By the Tuesday, she was the new interim general manager, and not long after that, she assumed the role of artistic director as well. Why she agreed to do this, I'll never know, because she certainly didn't need the work. Actually, I think I do know. It is because Sue genuinely believed in the power of the arts to engender a more creative, equitable, and inclusive society. In brief, it is an understatement to say that Sue worked tirelessly to pull together an international festival at short notice and with limited resources. She managed to quickly heal and rally an extremely dispirited staff. She engaged with other members of the diverse arts community in South Australia who responded so positively to her great warmth and inclusiveness. And she extended invitations to many eminent artists and creatives around the world to come to Australia at short notice to perform, and an amazing number of them said yes, only because it was Sue who was asking. In short, the success of the 2002 Adelaide Festival is fully attributable to Sue, whose extraordinary efforts created a miracle. I remember Sue telling me that she credited the Adelaide Festival gig as being the one that started her on being the path of being called on to fill in as CEO, GM, head honcho, big girl, whatever, for organizations that were short of a CEO for one reason or another. The remarkable thing was that Sue always made these organizations better during the time that she was with them, regardless of the circumstances in which she often found them and the duration of her tenure. Sue was a natural leader, open, warm, caring, honest, inclusive, and encouraging. Her default position was to trust people. She treated everyone the same. She was blindingly smart, but she gave everybody else the credit, taking little for herself. Lest this sounds too serious and worthy, it's important to notice that Sue's wicked sense of humor and love of the absurd never deserted her. I remember so many times we laughed till we cried. That laugh like a drain. And I feel sure there are men here whose tics succumb to Sue's favorite party trick. I feel truly honored to have been one of the many people Sue mentored. I learned so much from her. I treasure the fact that over time, we grew from being colleagues to becoming close friends. I treasure my memories of this exceptional person, and I'm so grateful that she was part of my life. I will miss that gorgeous laugh, her authenticity, and her great humanity. Vale Sue, I will never forget you. And we'll now hear from Wesley Enoch, who will appear on our screen.
Hi, I'm Wesley Enoch. I'm sorry I can't be there today. Sue's very important for me. In many ways, she is the epitome of an elder. We've lost a few elders in the last few years, and one most recently. And for me, Sue is one of those elders who know that maybe their body and their mind can't keep up with the social changes that are possible, and they become the supporter, they become the enabler, they become the person who listens and offers advice and helps people to become the best they can be. I first met Sue when I was directing Stolen. It was at the Melbourne Festival as part of Playbox and Ilbidgery. And this notion of me as a 28-year-old, where she'd put a lot of faith in me, a lot of people had, to make that show possible. And I remember when it had sold out season in 1998, Sue took me aside. She's artistic director of the Melbourne Festival, and we had a lunch, which I thought when the invitation came through was just going to be a whole lot of people, and it was just her and I. And one of the great pieces of advice was actually that to have faith in myself because she had faith in me. And anyone who knew Sue knew that that was one of her amazing strengths, is that she went, I don't back an idiot. I don't back people who can't achieve. I can recognize talent and I can make it happen for you by just being here. I love that about elders. And the passing of an elder actually leaves a space and says, okay, what is that Sue Nattrass space that we all now need to step into? How are we backing the next talent? How are we helping others to achieve? How, as we go beyond the capabilities of our body and our minds and our cultural limitations, How can we be the enablers of shifts and changes for the next generation? Sue Nattrass, I'm sorry I'm not there to pay my respects personally. I'm in rehearsal for another show. And I just want to say, as an Aboriginal person, people like you helped me to do something better, to make the world a better place because you were there as an ally. And I think for everyone in the audience, you'll all have these stories. You'll all have these stories of how Sue made a difference for you. Farewell, Sue. You've left a very big space. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Stephen Found, and I have the great pleasure of talking about Sue, my dear friend. Everyone who knows Sue knows that she was the most beautiful speaker. In actual fact, I've been to functions where I have no interest in the function. It was just to listen to Sue to speak. I'm slightly grumpy because we did have a bit of a deal. I did ask if she'd speak for my service, because I always thought she'd just be here. And I actually remember the first 4 words she ever said to me. And just worked it out, it was 43 years ago. I was a lighting technician for Strand Electric. I specialised in the lighting control boards, and they were incredibly unreliable. I loved that. I got to see a lot of theatre, and Sue Nattrass was the lighting designer on many occasions. I didn't have the guts to go up to her. I was like 17, 18, 19 years of age, and I looked like I was 12. She'd just look at me like, he's in the theatre again, so something's horribly wrong. And I had that effect on people in those days. Not much has changed, I think about it. And I can remember an opening night in those days, because the boards were so unreliable, the company would ask for a technician to be in the control room in case anything went wrong. There was nothing we could do, but we did it anyway. And I was always first to put my hand up. And it's comedy theatre. MMS lighting board has just blown up. It's the second opening in a row it's blown up. And I looked out, and there's Sue coming up, and for those who know the dress circle of the comedy theatre, it's a side. And she burst into the room, and I got the greatest joy. She went, "Fuck, not you again." And I instantly thought, she knows who I am, she recognises me. Yeah. There a friendship began, and when I decided to leave Strand and go out on my own, I had a little repair business called Data In, Data Out, 1984. Centre just opened, and I got the contract to maintain the Galaxy lighting systems in their warranty period. And she gave me my very first office. And it actually is on OP side of stage. In the emergency exit of this very theatre was my very first office. She believed in everyone. She would believe in the village idiot, even though he was the village idiot. But she let them figure that out. And she really did. She put enormous faith. And late in 84, I then teamed up with a gentleman called Ted Fregon, and we formed Bytecraft. And Bytecraft came up with lots of crazy ideas and products. And Sue, with another incredible visionary person called Alan Siggers, a technical director here at the time, believed in us. And Sue would sign off on many occasions that didn't exist, the product. She would often pay in advance because we didn't have enough money to do it. And that became the legacy of Bytecraft, and she was like a parent offering advice. And as the company grew and we thought huge, so we went to World Expo in 1988, and we thought that was exporting to the extreme. And from there we went international, lighting and then automation systems. And it was Sue always, how are you going? How can I help? And it's about the people. Are you training the people? How are you telling the story? And I'll never forget that. And she's running the Arts Centre, but she'd always say, if I can help in any way. We decided to take on New York. That can't be very hard, I thought. Went to New York, but shown the door very quickly by a guy called Jeremiah Harris. He sort of was the mafia of theatre. He looked out the window and asked how long I could hold my breath for, looking at the Hudson River. I thought he was joking, then realised he wasn't. Had me arranged, packed up and sent back to Australia. 2 days later he called, he said, I'm coming to Australia, I want to see your system. And I thought, oh, we've got him, this is it. He's realised we're the best. And he turned up seriously jet-lagged. I went into Sue and said, I've got this guy from America, he's super important to me. Like, we're just going to do everything in our power because if I can crack this guy, we've got New York. Automation, done. She's like, no problems. You tell me, I'll make the time. She literally, poor Jess, opened up her diary. And I walked with Jeremiah Harris, and he's You know, he's a legend. The Harris family is the legends of New York. And sat down, and she looked at him, and he said, "Hello, Sue." And she just said, "You hurt one fucking hair on his head. And you know what happened last time, Jeremiah?" And I'm like, it can't be possible that Sue Nattrass knows Jeremiah Harris. I called Jeremiah Harris this morning to tell him I was doing this and I wanted to talk to him. And he said, "You know, I've never met anyone like Sue." Turns out his father, Harris Sr., sent him here for a chorus line. Sue Nattrass was the stage manager. Can you believe it? She knew everybody. She was the stage, and he said, today, there was no one I've ever met, ever, that knew everything, could talk to the directors, could talk to us, could talk to the performers, but understood the audience, and would talk to front house. He said, no one does that. No one does that. And that's Sue Nattrass. Throughout the 90s, we grew internationally, and she hired a young gentleman who's the next speaker, Mr. John Drummond Montgomery, and she took this, what I thought was a pretty average lighting designer. I never told him that, but thought I should do it today. She took this guy, what the hell was she thinking, turned him into the deputy general manager, and he was outstanding. He was so outstanding, I actually went to Sue and said, "I'd like to hire John to be my international marketing guy. Like, no one can wine and dine and wine like John." And I don't think he had any idea what we sold. Didn't matter. It was just hugely successful. And the company grew, and we morphed, and we split, and ultimately the right thing to do was to be part of a bigger operation, and the company became part of a public company here. And I had the great honour of Sue serving on the board of Bytecraft, then under the ownership of Tattersall's, the public company. And I watched her at work at that level, concerned about people, training, teaching, and it was just an enormous privilege. We stayed connected forever. We talked shit constantly, and I have grand plans and theatre plans, and we'd talk about it, and just words of wisdom, but it always came to the people and the right people around you. And I think that's the legacy that Sue leaves. It's kind of fascinating now that company, Bytecraft, is now PRG, and PRG, his chairman is Jeremiah Harris, and the board member seat that was Sue's is John Montgomery. So talk about full circle. With that, thank you, Sue, and welcome John Montgomery. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John Montgomery. Sue once called that person the village idiot. And the village idiot is I think, one of the new J.C. Williamson in Australia, having owned and built 2 theatres in Sydney and many more under development, and Sue was very much a part of that. I was interviewed for my job at the Arts Centre. I took over Sue's old job as theatre operations manager by the then CEO George Fairfax and his then deputy Sue. Peter Redlick was the chair. Brian Stonier was on the board. He was, if those of you who drink Pinot Noir will be well familiar with Stonier. Pinot Noir wine flowed at board meetings. It was a very different time. But soon after I actually started, Sue took over from George, becoming the first female CEO of an Australian Arts Centre. And she took over at a time when the dark clouds were gathering. It was a time of industrial disputation on a next level scale. It was a time when the hirers were cranky because the rental for the theatres had to go up. It was a time when everybody was mortified that Bass booking fee went from $1 to $1.10. Can you believe that? Sue took over at this time and just faced everything with the aplomb, much of which you've heard about from the people who have spoken before. This building at the time was the subject of poor public opinion, and Sue worked tirelessly to open up the front doors of the theatre and make it more accessible to everybody. I had come to the Arts Centre as production manager and lighting designer from the Sydney Dance Company, and really was a little bit naive in the ways of arts management. And I don't think that George Fairfax on his own would have employed me, but Sue saw something and decided to back me, a story that you've heard a few times this afternoon. And so I began my apprenticeship with probably the greatest mentor and leader that I've ever had the privilege of working with. Sue was there when my relationships broke down, when new ones were rekindled. She was there when my kids were born. And she was there for every job that I applied for, she was my referee, including, and was instrumental when I was appointed as Australia's Consul General to Japan. And working with her was always an adventure, every day. And the problem was that she knew so much about every single job in the arts community. You could not pull the wool over Sue's eyes. She just knew too much. She was tough and only tolerated mistakes once, I learnt. And I can no longer remember what transgression I had committed, but I will never forget her admonishment. Montesaurus, she said to me. That was my nickname, but I felt it was a bit better than some of the others, like Gorilla Gantner and Gwen the Tatty Fraud. Montesaurus, she said, if I ever hear of that happening again, my size 10 foot will be so far up your ass, you'll be trimming my toenails with your teeth. I behaved much better from that point on. Sue was an incredible innovator and an amazing communicator. And she had a massive vocabulary, but could also make quite short, sharp and poignant points that were not easily forgotten. Because of the Arts Centre at the time's scant budget, with Sue's blessing, I had approached BHP to ask them if they would take Arts Centre senior management as part of their own senior management training program, to which they agreed, and the Arts Centre's contribution was to host a performance, some nibbles and a Q&A. And the CEO of BHP reflected to Sue that he felt the Arts Centre, or he had heard the Arts Centre took a rather large portion, the lion's share of available state arts funding. And Sue's response became, and remains today, a well-known catchphrase within senior BHP ranks to this very day and during their budgeting cycle. She gave the BHP folk that steady, blue-eyed gaze that she had, and she said, you have to remember that 4/5 of fuck all is still fuck all. I have never seen a more shocked group of senior executives in my life. But her message was in fact unequivocally received. Legacy is often thought of in physical terms, and it is true that Sue was very much the driving force behind completing the Arts Centre as it was designed. She hated that little stumpy spire that used to sit atop this building. You would remember that. And she hated the fact that Roy Grounds, the architect of this whole precinct's vision, had never been fully completed and realised. But I don't think that Sue's legacy can be defined in a physical sense. I see it differently. She had a remarkable effect on all of us who've spoken today, and a remarkable effect on many in the audience, I know. But we ourselves are just a microcosm of the cohort that has influenced, that has been influenced by Sue. And it doesn't end there, I feel. All of us who have been mentored by Sue have over the years mentored perhaps hundreds of others. And Sue used to talk a lot about the people in the Arts Centre and the arts community being her family. If we have all done our job well, and as she would have wanted us to do, we've passed on the importance of personal example, of humanity, of humour, of diligence and accuracy, pure professionalism, and of course the artful use of profanity. But most of all, if we've done our job well, we've passed on the fundamental Sue Nattrass truth that love is not only about common decency and humanity, but it is also an enormously powerful leadership tool. Thus, the real legacy of Sue is not measured by the physical, but by the many thousands of people who have ultimately been touched and influenced by her. Sue has a very large and loving family indeed. Thank you.